All right. So, for our next session, I'm actually really excited about this because we're talking about the art and science behind big visuals, designing dvLED, and projection mapping for maximum impact. And I have the two best people to talk about that I can think of. We've got Mark Coxon from AVI-SPL and Brian Mazzaros from OpenEye Global. What's up, you guys?
Hey, Steph.
Hey, Steph.
You are my two favorite people in the industry to just kind of yap to. So this session is probably just gonna be just a lot of us cutting up, but that's gonna be fun. That's gonna be great. So first of all, do y'all just want to talk a little bit about who you are and the work that you do?
Sure, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, sure. So Brian Mazzaros. I run a digital experience agency called OpenEye Global. We have been in this space now for 24, 25 years. I've lost count, and but we focus more on the creative execution of the experience, more of the visuals that really help tell a story or connect you into the space that you are in.
Perfect.
Awesome. And I'm Mark Coxon. I am with the Experience Technology Group XTG within AVI-SPL. So our team focuses on delivering kind of some of these wow factor, large format experiences. Been an AV for, 25 years as well, Brian. We're probably about the same like graduating class or entry class into AV.
I like
And
that.
then if anybody is familiar with me, I've written for rAVe since 2013 as well. So it's been 12 years just even here on rAVe writing. So you can find me here and at my normal job.
Where does the time go?
I
Mark,
know.
do we get something after 20? I feel like we're owed something.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
get the Christopher Walken watch from
Ooh.
Pulp Fiction.
I like that.
Yes. Or the bad MF wallet.
Yes, there you
Oh,
go.
Either
One
one.
of
yes,
the
You get
two.
the
You get your
yes,
choice.
dealer's choice.
yes.
It's in the 20-year Avixa A catalog. You didn't get you pick your honorary gift.
I'll write to them after this. Don't you worry,
Yes.
guys. I'm on it. All right. So let's start kind of big picture. What, in your opinions, defines a truly impactful large scale visual experience, not just in terms of resolution, but emotional resonance?
Ooh, Mark, I'll let you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we talk about this all the time with immersive environments, and I think there's more to immersion than just the big visual. The big visual is very, very important. We get hung up on resolution because it's something objective that we can go to right within AV, and we like the numbers and the speeds and feeds, and so the resolutions and the pixel pitches and those things are the easy things to kind of like gravitate towards because they're the things on the spec sheets and on the call outs. I would say, for me, the things that make a large visual experience compelling, one is obviously content, which Brian's going to talk to here in a minute. That's a big part of it. But if you think of it from a technology standpoint, color accuracy, depth, contrast, those things, our eyes actually see color and contrast before they see resolution, right? Those are the first two things that we pick up. Just as animals, we pick up contrast first because that's fight or flight, is something sneaking up on me from the side. Um, Visuals that encompass your peripheral vision, that go beyond the normal kind of 16:9 window that you can focus on in one thing. So custom aspect ratios, different shapes, being able to wrap something in 270 or 180 degrees or even 360 or go below your visual field. One of the coolest big visual things I've ever seen as far as like a concept was where you actually walked out on a platform into the middle of a dome style screen where you actually had the curvature below and above you as well, right? So if you looked over the edge, you're looking down into something, you left, right, and you're completely encompassed 270 degrees in all directions, top, bottom, left, right. So for me, when I'm thinking about big visuals, I'm thinking about how do I actually transport somebody into a new world? Putting up a very, very large 16:9 screen can be impactful if you have the right content. But I think, we automatically start to ignore the form factor that we see all the time. So, if we're seeing 16:9 visuals all the time in every place we go, the store, the grocery store checkout line, the doctor's office, your dentist chair, it's pretty easy to tune out the rectangle, right? If something captures your attention in a different way, it creates that moment of novelty that gives the opportunity to then bring somebody in and transport them into the world that you want. So when I'm thinking about big visuals, I think about it a lot in that way.
Yeah, I think building on what Mark said, I think the other part too is the connection to the space. I think it's often left to is the connection to the aesthetics so that it doesn't look displaced. It actually picks up on the architecture, or it picks up on where people are at that moment as they engage with visuals. I think that is often overlooked. And then the other part is the continuation of, you go from the physical now to the digital. It's the storytelling aspect of it. Is how well are you immersing and connecting with that audience to further tell the story of the space that they're in, that just falls in line with the narrative of what they're there at that environment for, to what they're witnessing, and the emotion that you're able to evoke by connecting with them, through those visuals. And it's a combination of both. I mean, for what you can do, if you do, as Mark kind of described, this great use of technology, but then if it's a lackluster visual performance, that just derails the whole experience. And so they need to be consistent. If you're putting all this investment and thought behind what you're presenting, it needs to be equal, if not greater than, of what you're showing visually on the screen to tell that story and to bring it all to life. So they're both so necessary to play off of one another for really to have that huge impact.
Yeah. I love what you said, Brian, about the connection to the space and the connection to the story and the relevance of the architecture and things like that. And I think that's where, when you get beyond pixel layers, or when you're thinking about layers, I know there was a lot of talk at ISE about the experiences in the booths where you had potentially like a transparent layer, and then you have an opaque layer behind it, and you're actually creating layers of video and layers of effects over each other. Or, obviously in projection mapping environments where you're taking physical objects and you're bringing those to life through adding some visuals, some motion, some light, some interest to them. And so, yeah, that's a huge part of, I think, the immersion and building an environment that's really, really compelling. So I love that you brought that in there.
No, absolutely. And when you're doing an install, a lot of times I think that we look at, there's two choices here to create this immersive experience. It's dvLED or it's projection mapping. And what are the specific trade-offs that you each have to weigh? I know content obviously has a lot to do with this because it's not going to look the same. But how often does creative intent drive this technical decision?
It's a good question. And I like this too, because Mark and I come at it from two different perspectives, in a degree. I mean, Mark is very technical, and I'm looking at it from the creative side. But at the same point too, like, we need to have that conversation in the beginning to understand where we can push it creatively to where the limitations might be for certain technology elements. And I think looking at projection mapping versus dvLED, I think part of it is that, what kind of illusion are we trying to get across? How are we, in one part, how are we handling the canvas that we're given to tell a story? And how best can we convey that story through these kind of different technologies? I mean, projection mapping offers up a lot of opportunities to highlight aspects of architecture, or, certain aspects of a physical environment, to where, dvLED gives us more of a flat canvas. But if we mask it accordingly, we can kind of create something very unique to it. So I think it's hard to give one straight answer, because I think, this is where the conversation Mark and I would end up having, and say, well, what story are we trying to tell? What kind of canvas do we need in order to accomplish and tell that story on? And then how much of the technology do we need to rely on to maybe give us a little bit more depth in that story? As Mark was kind of explaining, are we layering? How are we looking at those visuals? How can those visuals best be portrayed in layers, or around objects or corners or what have you, so that the story adds a little bit more, the visuals can add more depth into a space than maybe what we would get if we're looking at it from a 2D perspective using dvLED. So it's a tough one to say one over the other. I think we really kind of have to look at the space that we're dealing with in order to kind of figure out that direction.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that, very much so. I think, the architecture, the space, the environment, if it's a task-based environment, do the lights need to be high? Are there lots of windows, or are there all these other things, right, that would affect contrast in a projected system where you can't actually get an effective punch? And then you need to look at, how are we using then things like direct view LED or even transparent LED on glass or even curved OLED or some of these other technologies that we have as well, right? Like we think dvLED and projection, but there are some other technologies that can kind of be blended in there and played into that. I think then having to balance like what the differences in the two. Like if you have something that's projected and something that's dvLED, you want those to blend together in a way that's impactful, right? So like one of the funniest things I notice when I go into like a electronics store now, like go to Target, right? So I'll call it Target. You go to Target and you're walking towards the back where they have all their televisions displayed. And some of the light boxes showing like the iPhone things, like the static graphic light boxes that they have on their retail displays are actually brighter than their displays. So your eyes draw first to the actual static graphics and not to the digital graphics, right? So you have to think about things like that. Like if this is a part of the show that's really, really important, or part of the message that's important, is it being eclipsed by the other technology? Do we need to tone that down a little bit? Do we need to create some kind of like opaque layer over the top of it and just make it more of an atmospheric effect on the dvLED, and then we can match that better to the projection? So I think there are a lot of those things that go into play when you're thinking about how am I mixing and matching these technologies in a way that is cohesive, because when you see the joints, you get pulled out of the story, right? And so that's the biggest thing, right? Like when you start to notice the technology, the differences in the technology, the transitions between things that should be seamless. Now all of a sudden, the audience is no longer engaged in the message that you're trying to push forward. And so you have to really look at those moments. And sometimes you have to shoot the middle, right? Like you may say like, there's performance here, but if I put this whole room full of dvLED and I wrap all these columns, I'm also going to create a lot of heat in here. It's going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to have to. So there are all these other things that we have to think about as well, right? When we're putting people in those environments. So
Well, I
Things
think
that might like
as I say, the other side to it too is I mean, you really have to be very cautious too, because I think we've all seen kind of experiences to where there's an overwhelming amount of technology and not enough creative to live up to the expectations of what the technology might be driving. And I think sometimes some of that is not it's a failure not recognizing the kind of story you're telling and over engineering something, which then also sort of breaks or just lowers that expectation as well. I've seen that before where you sort of overspec or put too much into there, and the story doesn't need that type of delivery in order to get the point across. So there's that part of it as well, which is this kind of balance of what is just enough in terms of providing us that creativity through the technology, so that we're really taking advantage of what is there, versus us not living up to that that quality of what is there from either resolution or to some of the other effects that are possible with it. But if the story doesn't have that ability to really take that on, we shouldn't be that shouldn't be specified into it too.
Yeah. That not everything's a big wow moment, right?
No,
Sometimes you need
exactly right.
you need quiet, or sometimes you need space. Or if somebody's coming in off a busy street, maybe the first thing to do isn't to hit them with a big visual. Maybe it's to give them a transition period to decompress from the journey, get ready for what's ahead, and then you push them into something that then reinvigorates them, right? So like even thinking about how you stage that story in a lot of ways, and I'm sure Brian's really good at that with what he does in the creative, is like how do we actually then take this journey that you're looking for your customer to go on. They come in the door and they bring this baggage with them. So we need to decouple them from the baggage and the environment that they were in. We need to ready them for the thing that we want them to do. We need to understand what we need to tell them in order to gain their trust, get their attention, and then deliver the message that we want. And then we need to do that in a way that's compelling, in a way that creates action out the back end, that creates the desired result for the client, right? So and then how does technology enable that is the fun part, for us on the integration side.
Something else that kind of comes up is pixel pitch a lot, because what's trendy and what's popular right now is like the tightest, most narrow pixel pitch that could ever exist. And we just keep shrinking it and keep shrinking it. But like, that's another thing that like maybe you don't need all that, because maybe people don't need to be all up in there to see what's going on. Maybe the viewing distance like that you're wanting to create is much farther. So do you want to talk about that, like kind of like, you know, more of that dichotomy of like, yes, all of this new technology is out and that's fantastic, but like maybe we just don't need all that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Brian, I'll
No,
jump into this one right away, because this is where I kind of geek out. I think we get caught up on total resolution, And I did an AV as food about this a long time ago, right? With Raisin Bran, like total resolution. If you say there are 2 scoops of raisins in every box, in a box of Raisin Bran, that sounds like a lot of raisins, right? But what if it's the king size box versus the small box? Is it the same 2 scoops of raisins? Because if it is, you get a lot more raisins per bowl of cereal in the smaller box than you do in the bigger one, right? So when you think about resolution, you're just getting total pixel count. And you have to spread that pixel count over a very large area, and depending on how that is. So you're really looking for perceived resolution or pixel density, right? And that's why dvLED manufacturers will tell you the pixel density of a screen and not the total resolution, right? You're buying modules and you're trying to get a certain pixel density for people to see. You're right, Steph, as far as the resolution goes. So it really depends on viewing distance, and it depends on the detail of the content. There are 2 things there, right? Like if you have a lot of text, you're going to need some tighter resolution to resolve text. If you have more atmospheric effects and things, you can get away with a lot larger resolution or larger pixel pitch. If you think of the sphere, so everybody's familiar with the sphere.
Mhm.
The outside of the sphere, the pixel pitch on the outside of the sphere is 225 millimeters.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're not talking about high density LED on the outside of the sphere. It is immensely, spread out. But because it's so large and you're viewing it from a long ways away, that's the intent of the outside of the sphere, and that works just fine. And on the inside, it's much tighter than that.
Mhm.
Even on a screen like they filmed The Mandalorian on, it's only 2.5 millimeter pixel pitch. The screen that they filmed The Mandalorian for, XR, right? So 2.5 can be still good for movie style production, depending on the distance of the camera from the screen and then the actors in front of it, and then you get that depth of field effect. So all of these things mean that we really have to think about the application. We have to think about where people are standing and what they're looking at to view. If you're thinking about things that need to be viewed very close up, especially anything interactive, because now we can do LED. A lot of the LED is glue on board type technology or an epoxy coated technology that you can actually touch now. And when you can touch something, you're going to be about 3.5 to 4 feet away from it, because that's how long your arm is. Well, at least my arm. Your arm might only be 2 feet, Steph. I don't know. I'm sorry, but my arm is about 3.5, 4 feet away from the screen, right? So if I'm going to touch the screen and I'm going to be doing something, that resolution needs to be such that I can resolve it at 3.5 to 4 feet, right? So interactive applications, you're going to really tight pixel pitch. Close viewing, really tight pixel pitch. And then past that, you're really thinking about viewable distance and all of those other things. So I think we get caught up in pixel pitch a little bit. The other thing to think about is, with pixel pitch is what's the workflow getting the content there? You can do a lot of pixel pitch, but if you have to create, 32K masters to feed it pixel for pixel information, you just ruin Brian's world, right? And then how do we distribute that? And how much back-end processing power do we need to move all of that pixel data over to that screen and do the screens? If it's 10-bit color, then all of a sudden you need even more processing power to do that, right? And so all of these things go into that pixel pitch conversation, but it really should start with what's the user experience at the distance you intend them to view it from. Then you figure out what the ideal is, and then you work backwards to see then what's possible. And then you may have to make some compromises once you start to get into like, what is the content, what's the processing, what's the flow. We're going to have to dial this down a little bit, right? So, but that's the way that I go through it in my head.
I get scared on cost immediately. Yeah. When any client starts to look at sub 1 mil, I automatically start to shiver, because then that takes away from creative budgets. And to Mark's point, then it's very taxing on us in terms of the quality that we're producing, which then I know goes on to the quality of the players behind the scenes that are having to process it. And I think that's the challenge too, is because when you look at pixel pitch and quality, I mean, to Mark's point, obviously you want to take into account is how is the experience relevant to the distance that the viewer is seeing the technology at. And so that needs to be defined very early on, both from the visual storytelling part to also the architectural. Again, I go back to the space planning as well. But, there is that, part of the budget question, which does scare me, because the more that we try to go with the advanced technology, the advanced resolution of the displays, the more taxing it is on Mark to come up with a solution to support that, but then also on us too to create content that is of that quality. It's not, there's a lot of rendering time, there's a lot of design time, and also there's also the part of it too, to where we're constantly kind of put in situations too where we don't have that ability to actually go out there and shoot raw footage to use in experiences. or we don't have that ability or the budget to go through and produce something through like an Unreal Engine. We have to use stock assets, and those stock assets are not of that 8K quality just yet. We're dealing with 4K, so we also have to kind of deal with where we're at in that kind of position in the design process too. So it is kind of a balancing act, and that's the always part I get fearful of is with some of these experiences, is that there's such high expectations for visual delivery, but there's a low expectations of what that costs to achieve that.
Yeah.
And there's the part of realizing that the technology can do that, but there's the hardware piece to it, and then there's the creative piece to it, and those budgets need to be aligned, and those expectations set up what those visuals are going to look like for any of these. So I go through a lot of those moments. I need my own sort of decompression moment. I go from initial meeting to decompression zone, and then level set, and then into a good meeting with Mark where we can come to a realization of how do we achieve this desired effect, taking into account all of that.
Yeah. I think, on the back end, we think about pixel pitch, we think about resolution, we think about all those things. The other part of this is like, what is the content management system? What is the back end processing power needed to process this? Like, what kind of video server do you need? What kind of, video distribution do you need? If you're doing things that are 4K, you need, different extenders. If you're doing 4K at 10-bit, then you do have 8. Even in dvLEDs, not all dvLED is created equal as far as some of those things go, right? So there's a receiving card in a dvLED cabinet, and typically that's an 8-bit receiving card. If you need cabinets that do 10-bit, you need a receiving card that can handle 10-bit. If you do that, then you decrease the bandwidth. So you need more home runs, back to the controller, and you need an extra controller now to run that same wall if you run it in 8-bit versus 10, because it can only run so much pixel data. When you increase bit rate, you increase pixel data, and now you can't run as many cabinets off of that one output on the controller that you could before, right? So you have all these other downstream effects that if you're not working with somebody who understands the environment, that dvLED environment, they can go there. And then the same thing with projection mapping. If you're doing that same thing in your video processing out, now you're thinking about blending zones, you're thinking about all of those things. So if you have like a lot of high-end text and you're going across multiple blending zones, the possibility of that text then being slightly fuzzy through blending zones is really high, right? Especially if you have multiple blending zones vertically and horizontally across. If you do 30 projectors stacked through, 10 wide by 3 high, you've got all these blending zones, right? And so if that's art, those blending zones can be disguised quite a bit, right? The other thing you have to think about with projection mapping and those kind of spaces is also just video black. A projector isn't infinite contrast. When it's on, you can turn a projector on in a dark room and you'll know where the projector light path is. You'll see it on the wall. That's video black. Video black is not the same as black, which is complete darkness, right, in a room. You're like, oh, the projector's showing on that wall. It's showing black, but it's showing on that wall. When those black levels overlap, you get stripes, right? And so depending on content, you may, if your environment is really dark and you don't have light in there that's disguising some of that, then you might not want to go to complete black through some of your fades and things like that. You may want to crossfade images that are brighter, et cetera. So you don't now expose these places in the technology, right? So there's always this dance between the content creator, Brian, right, who's interpreting the story and turning it into visuals, the technology itself and what the technology is going to expose in that content, depending on the environment that it's at. And then how we go back and forth to make sure that we're mitigating those things. And the final product is the story that the client wanted to see, right? With the big visual, because they wanted a wow factor experience that told this story. They don't care how you deliver it most times, right? As long as they can afford it, they don't care how you deliver it. They just want it to look good and sound good. And they want their client to enjoy it in the way that they saw it in their heads. And so there's always this great back and forth between content and technology. And it's why oftentimes either the story is left to the end, and that's a problem, right? People buy technology. They're like, I'm going to fill this wall, and then later we'll figure out what to do with it. That's always a miss. Or the other thing is that they start talking about story and content and all those things, and then they wait until 2 years later when the building's being built to then figure out what the technology is. And they didn't have that chance to have that back and forth between content and technology to figure out what's going to work best. And then they might not have the infrastructure, rigging, et cetera, that they need for the technology that is actually going to deliver the best experience, and you get a compromise. So
the other part too that, kind of touch on a few is it's also the quality too of the displays and technology too, because there's also, the importance in terms of color and color balance and the way that for what we're producing so that, reds and yellows and those colors come across as they are intended. Because, Mark, I'm sure I've seen it, before, to where, there'll be certain, LEDs that are spec'd in that just do not have that certain color balance or that contrast that we're looking for, that match up with the visuals that we've created. Client sees one thing, but then in the full physical environment, that may not come across as what was intended too. So there's a little bit of that too that's also kind of important to that process too, in terms of what you are specing. You talked about black.
Yeah.
Now that is being portrayed too. All of that goes back into this visual and this visual break, or just the quality of best portraying the content in the physical space.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I heard about with that, and it's with manufacturers that maybe are lower priced, et cetera. Sometimes they're buying the materials. There are subcomponents, right? So the LED lights themselves may have a variance of 10 to 15% in a class B, and it may have a variance of 5 to 10% like in a class A, right? And so those, they can never actually be calibrated the same, because the variance in the engineering of the actual little light bulbs, the little LED modules on the board are just not the same.
Mhm.
And the other interesting thing I heard with one was that they were using different kinds of plastic to embed them in. So we know that LEDs are always mounted to these plastic, backboards, and sometimes that's glossier than others. So then when you look at the screen, when things go to black, you can actually see the patchwork of the different plastics that they used over the course of the time that they sourced materials, because they're not all the same matte black finish, right? So when you go to these higher end products, you get more consistency, you get higher end subcomponents, you get some of those things. So when you think you're paying, you're just buying pixel pitch, you may not be doing an apples to apples, right? Because there are a lot
Right.
of other things going on in the background that are going to make these things perform differently in the real world or be perceived differently through the human eye. And so, I always, the shootouts that we used to have at Infocom and stuff like that, I thought were one of the most amazing things and things we should bring back. But we should do a lot of side by side. We should do as many mock-ups as we can. We should do test fits. We should do those things and look at the components that we're using before we take them out large scale, and make sure that we're picking products that are consistent and actually delivering the visual impact that we want.
Absolutely. We got a question in from the audience, and I feel like we could do a 45-minute session just on this question. So I'm going to throw this to y'all and just let y'all have fun for a bit. So, how do you each see AI working with or advancing and developing immersive displays in the future? And that's from Gary.
Ooh, that's a softball question. Wow, Mark, if you don't mind, from an AI perspective, obviously there continues to be advancements in terms of how we generate imagery based upon the use of AI. Whether you look at it from generative art, to where we're analyzing first, different data sets, or we're analyzing conditions in an environment that we can then code accordingly to certain visuals, so that what they're seeing is in real time rendered based upon conditions and people's behaviors and actions. So, I love where that is growing into from a visual perspective. And I think it also makes storytelling a lot more dynamic and relevant, to where we can be reactive to, again, people's emotions, behaviors, to where we see them in the space, to where they are in the story, and then be able to match that. And that is something that we haven't had that ability to do in the past necessarily. Everything is timed or sequenced, and we have to hope for that certain reaction, whereas here we can be in real time reactive to them. And obviously the back end is supportive of it, to where processing power is there, or if not, further beyond, to where we can provide those visuals, and we do have those platforms available to us. So I'm excited from a storytelling perspective on what the next level of that will look like for it. And I will say, Mark could speak more to the technical part, but I think, where Mark is driving on the technical aspect, it is going to give us a canvas that is far more dynamic than what we've been able to play with before. And then we can able to bring in AI to really take full advantage of that. So it's exciting from a storytelling perspective, and then just that reactiveness that we get from it.
Yeah, I try to. I mean, I love generative content, the whole AI angle on that. I think that's something that we're starting to see more and more with Rafik and some of these artists becoming very popular and doing AI content generation. We know that that creates relevance and all the things you're talking about, Brian. The ability to take content and transcribe it into different formats
Mhm.
through AI or to add pieces to it is really big. I think from a hardware perspective, some of the really cool things that I think can start to happen is you can take 2D imagery and make 3D imagery. So if you've been seeing a lot of the stuff coming out from Adobe and their Summit and everything else, right? I can now take a piece of video and now I can actually turn that into a multi-layered piece of video, right? Where I can actually extract a foreground, a midground, a background. Maybe I can play that back on 3 different displays that are distanced from each other by 15 feet. I get, real parallax as somebody walks by, that the foreground moves in a different way than the background. I'm like almost making animation cells out of 2D content. I don't have to re-render all that to do it, right? Now that gives me an opportunity to create a display that's a lot different than just the 2D layer that we're talking about in LED. I can have LED at the back. I could have a couple transparent OLED layers in front of it. Now all of a sudden I can have somebody that's skiing down a mountain comes through the midground into the foreground and throws snow into the foreground, right? And that's really compelling. And it looks like a window when you walk by because the landscape moves at a different rate than the foreground does, than the midground does, which we don't get typically without head tracking or single viewer 3D kind of applications. This gives a multi-viewer experience that's glassless, that gives depth and parallax and all of those things. So I think we're going to have some really cool opportunities with AI. I think the other thing that's driving content or driving technology with AI, it's a halo effect in that the more that we're developing compute devices, GPUs to handle the amount of data that AI needs to handle in order to do processing, it actually aids us in having better video processors, better front end equipment, et cetera, that can then feed these systems, right? So the more advancement we get in GPUs and video processing, et cetera, for AI's sake, we're going to get a halo effect of that coming into our equipment. As manufacturers are able to take advantage of those technology innovations and then bring them into audiovisual equipment as well. So we get kind of that exponential kind of coupling effect, the doubling effect that we get out of those technologies coming out of there. So I think we're going to see a lot of cool stuff happen with AI over the next few years. And then, of course, from a design perspective, being able to model things, being able to put it in different light, being able to do virtual mock-ups, all of those things, AI and Unreal unlock for us as well.
Yeah.
So on the design side, we're going to see a lot of efficiencies start to happen there.
100% agree with both of you. So I'm interested to kind of hear from y'all in terms of like projects, what normally comes first, and if you've had a project or an example where a really solid creative concept was the thing that came first, and then you had to find the technology to match that, or if it's usually a client that's like, I know I want this, and you have to then develop the content to match that, if that makes sense. I feel like I did not say that very eloquently.
No, it makes perfect sense.
You're smiling like you.
No, no, it's no, it makes perfect sense. And I I don't know, from my side, and Mark, I probably you and I can kind of commiserate in a lot of these. I feel that when we get involved in these projects and we get these theme books that come in, designers tend to forget that what you can mock up in Photoshop or Illustrator is naturally going to define gravity and in all aspects of science. And the reality is, half of that can't be accomplished. And just because you can mock up in After Effects doesn't mean the world works like that, unfortunately. So I find ourselves in that situation a lot of times, and I find ourselves more on educating of what is possible
Mhm.
and kind of working backwards to where you have to come with examples almost of our mood board on top of their mood board to come to a middle ground and saying, I understand the narrative of what you're trying to achieve, but there's ways to approach that through real examples versus what you're necessarily receiving. Now I'm speaking from the background of majority of our projects. We get engaged after an EGD group or a themed entertainment group has been involved in doing a theme book as far as the story part of it. And then we kind of come in, sometimes I think where Mark even slot in too, and saying, well, how do we take that and bring that into reality? Really kind of looking at that story, the physical space, the drawings, and saying, well, how does the technology allow for that effect to take place? And how can we visually create that? And that's, unfortunately, that's how we end up starting a lot of these projects, to where the creative concept is there, but the creative concept is not, I say probably half of it is executable in the way that it's been designed. And that's just the nature of it too, because I think a lot of those design agencies are unfortunately just not as versed in technology and what the limitations are, or even beyond that as well. Because out of a lot of those meetings, you come away with, more ideas that actually elevate that story, or change the way that they physically thought that someone would interact with the space as they laid it out. So you end up kind of creating more problems than what you're walking into, just because of that kind of conversation. So um, I feel like when we're allowed as an agency to kind of control that narrative and for them to go back, that's when those concepts become more realistic to, bring to Mark and have him, able to engineer the design of the AV to accommodate what we're trying to do visually, just because we know enough to know what Mark is going to suggest or recommend, and know Mark is not going to, reach to the screen and choke me out because I've recommended something that is physically impossible. So, but there's a lot of that I think we try to, if we can get to control that piece of it, we try to filter that out. But unfortunately, we walk into a lot of situations to where it's just not possible. And I think that just it does change just over time as more designers start to become more aware of what is there and do come to InfoComm and do come to other shows and do start to see other experiences that are popping up. I mean, a decade ago, to find any of these kind of experiences we were talking about was virtually impossible unless you went to Orlando. And now you can go to a lot of other metropolitan cities and see generative art examples. You can see highly immersive experiences that are roaming through museum tours or even just production, theatrical productions that are, bringing in part of it. So it is kind of changing it. But back to my original point, we never really kind of walk into situations where I think we're, we can say yes to everything that's been presented to us.
Right.
Yeah. I think, from my perspective, obviously being on the integration end, we're often brought in at the back end of a construction project, right? So we probably see a lot more of like, we just want to build this than we do like, we have this story, like how do we start there? We do have a partner network where we do get a lot of that, and the results, I will say, are always better when we have that early access to what the intent of the space is. So, as a qualifier, it's always better when we understand that, and we're constantly campaigning to be on the front end. And when we work with somebody like Brian on the front end, you're talking to different stakeholders, right? Brian's talking to the marketing department, the C-suite, the people that have a stake in the story that's being told. We're often talking to somebody who's been tasked with finding the technology. The CEO goes into Salesforce and comes back to the office and goes, I want a waterfall in my lobby. That's what they do, right? And then they say, well, the waterfall's made out of LED. So we'll send that to the IT department and they can source some LED for us. And it becomes that type of procurement ask. And then our job then is to try to back that truck up a little bit. We'd love to sell you, 100 square meters of LED in your lobby. What are you trying to do with it? What's going to be playing on it? Who's the audience that it's intended for? Who in your company is going to be providing the content that goes on it? Who's the stakeholders that are in charge of that? Can we get a meeting together with them? And so many times our process is then trying to identify backwards who those stakeholders are, and then try to enlist our contact or the person who came to us as an ally in that process, because that's a lot of work for them too, right? We're asking them to do a lot of things that are outside what they normally do. They normally get pricing, buy product, hire a contractor, deliver something. But if I deliver 100 square meters of LED in a lobby, we don't have anything to show on it, there's no ROI. There's zero ROI for the company until they start to use it for the intended purpose. So that's always how we try to position it. Hey, we want to make you look good, and we want to make sure that we're all being a good shepherd of the company's investment. It would be worthwhile to have a 2-hour meeting with these stakeholders to make sure that we all understand what the intent is before we start designing something that doesn't meet that intent. And that'll usually, it frames them up as the hero. They've found the resource. They're going to go back and say, hey, I found this great resource and we have some questions and we want to make sure this lands. So we do a lot of that. I always say, the garbage truck beep, 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 beep is like what I start to entail anytime we want wow factor. Okay, no, you don't. You don't want an LED screen. You want your customer to do something. And what is that? And then we move it backwards. But of course, if we can work with a creative partner up front, an architect, someone like Brian, et cetera, all of those things work together. The space, the architectural implications, and when you're in the phase where you're in design development for a building, that's the best time for us to all be together, making sure it's there. And yeah, we may have to take a back seat for another 6 months until it's built to actually start doing our work. But we should be at that table, in those initial phases to make sure that everything's planned right.
Yeah. I think that's the theme. I mean, if I had to kind of say one thing to put it on to, is just this collaboration really needs to start very early on. And as much as I know one group of people try to dictate, the reality is you need all three of us at the table. You need, who's ever in charge of designing the space, whether it's an architect or an interior, you do need the AV team and you do need the creative team there. It can't be done in silos, because then these projects fall apart very quickly. To Mark's point, it's great if the CTO takes on the tech piece and specs in this amazing, pitch display, but if the creative is not there to support that because the budget hasn't been allocated towards it, when that conversation could have been had very early on to level set on creative budget, then Mark and I could have aligned and say, look, Mark, this is what we're able to produce in resolution wise. Mark's is great. This is what the pixel pitch can be. And then in the middle, everything looks perfectly. Because why? Because Mark and I had a chance to be at the table at the very beginning to align on what that desired objective is. It seems very straightforward. It seems like let's all be friends.
But it's not. Yeah, but that's not how it goes.
It is not how it goes.
How I know it's a good session is, which obviously I was here and I know, but secondly, the networking chat on launch is popping off. So that's how I know that everyone else thinks it's good too. And George said in the networking chat, we were just asked about a waterfall in the lobby. After a rough estimate, that was shot down quickly.
Yeah. Sometimes you just have to, sometimes I call it setting flags. So sometimes the rough order of magnitude, just doing some quick MSRP math and saying that's probably north of $2 million and seeing if they either ski through the flag or they go off the course. Like that's a good exercise as an integrator, just to make sure that everybody's kind of moving towards the same thing. For sure.
Well, I think we are about out of time. So the last thing I'm going to ask both of you to do is talk a little bit about where people can find you on the internet, because I'm sure they've got lots of questions for you. They're happening right now. I just don't have time to ask all of them. So I'm going to give them the opportunity to ask you guys on the internet. Mark, how about you?
I am Mark Coxon on LinkedIn. So if you look for me on LinkedIn, if you type in Mark Coxon, I will probably be the first hit. I did see a couple questions specifically pointed at me in the chat, like from Crystal, et cetera. Please feel free to just throw me a message on LinkedIn, best place. I am AV Phenom on X. I still am on X, even though it's a little different than it used to be. But AV Phenom on X. And Instagram, I'm Kicky No Punchy. So don't ask, you figure out later.
Brian, what about you?
Okay. Focus. No. Brian Mazzaros on LinkedIn. Brian with a Y. And then you can also find me at X, more under OpenEye Global as the agency. OpenEye is one word. And then Instagram as well as OpenEye Global. And then obviously you can get to us through our website as well at openeyeglobal.com.
Amazing. Oh, and Brian, don't let me forget to remind you, happy National Brian Day to all of those who observe, and we are observing that right now as we have Brian Mazzaros on this panel. So to all of our Brians with a Y out there, happy Brian Day, you guys.
Happy Brian Day. Happy Brian Day.